Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So before I start today's class, two things I want to emphasize. Number one, I send everyone an email. So in the email, so there's a sample test. That's what we are going to discuss, and that's also is going to be the midterm one looks like. But in midterm one, we only have, I believe, 30 questions or maybe even less. But for the sample test, we have more. Okay, so just make sure you receive the email. I also believe the sample test is also on Canvas, right? This is number one. And then number two, in the coming Monday, we will have our first midterm, right? So the midterm, so what we are going to do is we are going to do it online. But what I need is you log into Zoom on the regular, like our regular test time, right? Once you log into Zoom, and then so I will give everyone the access code so you can work on your midterm. So please make sure so you have video open on that day. Okay, find a comfortable place and so you have video access. So that we make sure this exam is properly taken, right? That's it. So now let's back to our material. Okay, so there's one thing left to discuss in this chapter. So which is equilibrium. So in this chapter, where we start with demand, and then we look at the supply, right? Just a reminder. So here we are in the perfect competitive market. Okay, so what that means there are so many buyers and so many sellers. None of them can influence the price. Right? Everybody just take price as given. Take P as given. Okay, so this is a perfect competitive market. Okay, so if they are taking price as given, and then that leave a question. So that's what we are trying to address on Monday and today, so that we can close this chapter, which is, so where does the price coming from? So that's the key things we want to understand in the last part of this chapter, right? Okay, so what we have learned on Monday is, so eventually there's a price. The price here is $1. There's a mysterious price, or there's a magic number or magic price that is going to make us move to equilibrium. What happens in equilibrium? In equilibrium, demand will equal to supply, right? So they're going to cross each other at 10. Now the question is how we end up with in that particular case. So the way we discuss is, so you either above $1 or you below $1. And then you're going to see whether we in this territory or in this territory. Okay? There's going to be a magical force. And it turns out it's called invisible hand. So this magic force is going to, if we are in this territory, it's going to bring the price down. If we are in this territory, and then so it's going to push the price up. Right? So now let's review what we have seen and what we have discussed. Okay? Start with the price is above $1. And then we are going to see a surplus, right? So this quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So we have a surplus. Because the existence of this surplus, some sellers or some producers cannot get rid of what they produce. Okay, and then but they have incentive to get rid of what they produce, otherwise they won't get cash, they won't get income to pay for the rent, to pay for the food, so on and so forth, right? And then those unlucky guys who cannot sell their stock, they're going to push down the price. Right? Or in summarize, surplus don't loss, seller will reduce price so that they can move goods off the shelf. So what is behind their motive? Okay, so behind their motive is they are behaving on their best interest, or what I just told you is called invisible hand. Right? So this is when we above the price. Okay. Now on the other hand, if the price becomes so low, 0.75, then opposite things is going to happen. So supply is going to lessen demand. And then so we are going to have a shortage. And that's opposite things are going to happen, right? So because of the shortage, there's some buyers who cannot get what they need. Just think about in the market of face mask. Think about in the market of lunchbox or whatever market you can think about. If there's a shortage and then the buyer willing to pay higher price to get what is essential for them, and the seller they able to raise the price to get rid of what they have, right? Or so to sell more. Okay, so similarly, the price will return to equilibrium, right? Or in other words, shortage do not loss, seller will increase price to increase revenue. Or you can say, okay, seller can increase price. And why the seller can increase price? Because there's demand there. Because there are people who want the product, but they do not have one available. So they're willing to pay higher price. All right, okay, so eventually we are here. Now once we are here, no one has the incentive to change their mind. Why is that? If the price went up, right? And then, so the demand side is going to lose. Why? Because they already have what they need. On the other hand, if the price went down, and then the supply side is going to lose. Why? Because they already sold what they have. Why would I decrease the price? There's no point, right? So now we are in the equilibrium. Okay, so we have seen this question before. Let's just quickly review, right? So at price of $5, price of $5. Okay, and the quantity supplied, now we look at here, quantity supplied is 13, this is supply. So quantity demanded, we look at this blue line, is 6, this demand, right? At a price of $5, and then there's a surplus, supply about exceed demand. So actually the surplus is 7, right? And similarly, you can think about or ask yourself, what is going to be the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at a price of 2, and what happened, right? Okay, so this question. Now, so given the equilibrium model we just discussed, now we can do some analysis, right? So the first thing we can think about is, so what happened when the demand curve shift? Okay. But before I explain to you what happens when demand curve shift, so now we need to think about, or just remind yourself, this is like good review, what caused this demand curve shift? Right? So we talk about 5 factors. So there are 5 factors can cause the demand curve shift. Okay, and so the demand curve shift, there are 2 possibilities: either shift to the left or shift to the right. Shift to the left means the demand is decreasing. Let's use negative. Shift to the right means the demand is increasing. Let's use plus. Okay, just review the earlier part of the chapter. Make sure you understand how those 5 factors can cause a demand curve shift, right? But now let's just say if there's a factor cause the demand curve shift to the right, right? So move from D1 to D2. Shift to the right means there's increase in demand. Okay? So now what happens? So once we shift to the right, okay, and the demand curve it becomes D1. Now immediately you're going to see what are we going to see? We are going to see a shortage, right? Because at P1, so that's where we start. At P1, Q1 is the quantity supplied and quantity demanded, but first this quantity supplied. Okay, so quantity supplied equal to quantity demanded. When demand is D1. Okay, so this is where we start. Now the demand moved to D2, so the demand is going to change to here. Change it here, right? Now you compare the quantity supplied. Let's use this triangle to represent, because there's nothing changed in terms of supply. But now demand increase. Okay, so the quantity demanded increase. Now what are we going to see? We are going to see a shortage, right? So the supply is less than demand because of the demand increase. Now if there's a shortage, and then what happens? Now, because of the existence of shortage, there are people who cannot get what they need, and they're willing to pay higher price. If they are willing to pay higher price, and then the supply, the quantity supplied will increase. Okay, so now let's see how the slides went down, right? So look at it here. So this represented by here. The quantity supplied increase, right? But I want to emphasize, so the supply curve itself didn't change because there's no factor cause the supply curve change. What we observe is the quantity supplied increase. And why the quantity supplied increase is because there's a shortage. The shortage leads to the price to increase, right? So let me erase everything and summarize what we just discussed, okay? So how these events unfold. First, we are at equilibrium, okay? So QD equal to QS. Sorry. QD equal to QS. This is where we start. Now, secondly, what happened? There is an increase in demand, leads to shortage. Okay? And this shortage leads to price to rise, right? Because there are people who can't get what they need, so the price will increase. Now, third, the price increase leads to quantity supplied increase. Okay, just keep in mind quantity supplied increase. In the second step, there's increase in demand, right? And then so eventually new equilibrium. Okay, in the new equilibrium, what happens? So now we compare here. So in this new equilibrium, the price increase and the quantity increase, right? Now we look at other possibility. What happened when the supply curve shift? So supply, right? Again, similar to demand. So you need to review your slides or review your textbook. So there are 5 factors cause the supply curve to shift, right? And there are 2 possibilities: negative shift, which means the supply shift to the left; positive shift, which means the supply shift to the right, right? So this is supply. And finally, you need to differentiate between supply shift and the quantity of supply to change, right? So those are the things you need to make sure you understand, you make sure you're familiar with, right? So now say for example, for some reason, there's a decrease in supply. The supply curve shifts to the left. And similarly, immediately you're going to observe a change, right? Because immediately price is not able to adjust immediately. Okay, now what happened? So the supply decrease, then the quantity supplied is going to drop. But at this price P1, the quantity demanded stay at Q1. And from here, you can immediately see there's a shortage. Right? So now, okay, so this shortage is going to lead to the price to increase. Right? So this is coming from here. This is a shortage. Okay, the shortage leads the price to increase. Okay? So now this increase in price is going to lead to quantity demanded to drop. Right? Now again, so keep in mind, nothing leads to the demand curve shift. So then, so what we're going to see is only a decline in quantity demanded. Right? So that's represented by shift from E1 to E2. Okay, we just move along this demand curve because the demand curve is the same. Right? So like I just did in previous slides, we can replay the event. One, so we are in equilibrium. Q is equal to QD. Two, the supply decline. Okay, and then there's a shortage. And then leads to price to increase. And then that leads to QD decline. Now three, in new equilibrium. In new equilibrium, what we're going to see is P increase, Q decline. Right? So you compare E1 to E2. So P increase and the Q decline. Right? So this is similar to before. Now, before I show you this practice question, I want to draw a table to summarize the possibilities. Okay? So let me use my upper right part. Okay? So there's a demand change, there's a supply change. Okay? So both demand and supply, they can positive or negative, positive or negative. Right? And then, so I want to, we want to see what is going to be impact on, apologize, so this is not going to work. No, so we want to see the impact on price and the quantity. Okay, so let me use this part so we have more space. So we want to see the impact on price and the quantity. Right? And so there are four possibilities. Okay, so there's a demand positive, demand negative, supply positive, supply negative. Okay, what we have discussed in this slide is negative supply shock. So this goes to the last row. Okay, so as we just saw, if there's a negative demand, if there's a negative supply shock, the price is going to increase. The quantity is going to drop. Right? Okay, so this is what we just discussed in this slide. Right? And in the previous slide, if there's a positive demand shock, and then we are going to see price increase and the quantity increase at the same time. Right? So maybe we can look at the previous slide. Okay, so in the previous slide, there's a positive demand shock. So E1 move to E2, and then price increase, quantity increase. Okay, now I'll go back to here. So there are other two possibilities. Okay? So you should be able to fill this blank yourself, but I can do that for you. So if there's a negative demand shock and then both price and the quantity is going to drop, if there's a positive supply shock, price is going to decline, but the quantity is going to increase. So by looking at this table, right, what is this table? This table just shows us all the possible change in demand and supply, how they're going to affect equilibrium price and quantity. By looking at it here, so this is one pattern you should observe. From these four possible scenarios, what we learn is that, so if it's a demand change, so the P and the Q is going to move in the same direction, right? So either both increase or both decline, right? So they move in the same direction. On the other hand, if there's a change in supply, now we look at the bottom two rows, and the P and the Q, they're going to move in the opposite direction, right? So if it's a negative supply and then P increase, Q decline. If it's a positive supply and P decline and the Q increase, so they move in the opposite direction. Okay, so keep this in mind. So we will see this table again in the future when we discuss macroeconomic dynamics. Okay. Now we are ready to look at these practice questions. If garden genomes regain popularity, what will happen? Okay. To answer these questions, we need to identify whether this event is a demand shock or supply shock. Okay, when I say demand shock or supply shock, or when I say shock, meaning there's something caused demand or supply to change. Right? So first we need to identify. And then secondly, we need to identify to which direction it affects the demand or supply. And then finally, we are going to apply this. We're going to apply this table, the table I just drew. So then we can check out the impact on price and quantity. Right. Okay, very good. So here in this event, certainly this is the impact on demand, right? Because it becomes popular. So it's not a supply. That's number one. Then number two, it becomes popular means the demand increase, right? It's like test change, meaning this is a positive demand shock, or there's an event to move the demand increase. Now, lastly, how would that affect price and quantity? So based on the table we just drew, right? So if it's a positive demand shock, so that is going to lead to the price and the quantity both to rise. Okay, so B is correct. Right. Now, the second practice question. If the cost of wood falls, what will happen to equilibrium price and quantity in the violin market? Okay, so we need to identify if this is a shock to demand or supply, and to which direction, right? And here, this background picture gives us some hint. The cost of wood, I should be a little bit more specific. So this is a wood for making violin. If the cost of the wood falls, so essentially the input cost falls, right? So if that's the case, so that's going to be a positive supply shock because it's cheaper to make violin, right? So supply is going to increase. There's no change in demand, right? So if this is a positive supply shock, again, just remind yourself the table we just drew, right? So if you cannot remember that table, so you can immediately draw a supply demand yourself, right? So this is supply, this is demand, this is supply, demand and supply. If the positive supply shock and then the supply curve shifts to the right, And now we are in a new equilibrium compared to the original one. And then immediately you can see the price decline and the quantity will increase. Right? So this is E. E is the answer. Okay, to summarize, we need to do the following 3 steps. Step number 1, identify. Identify. Is demand or supply? Number 2, to find out is positive or negative. Number 3, then apply. Apply the table we just discussed, or you can just draw a diagram yourself. Right. Okay, so let me skip this. Now we are going to look at things a little bit more complicated. Okay. So what we have discussed in the previous slides just said if there is a demand or if there's a supply change, what happened, right? And we have a table to show how the change in demand or how the change in supply is going to affect equilibrium price and the quantity. Now we are interested to see, so what would happen if the two things happen at the same time? Meaning, if there's a demand shock and a supply shock happens simultaneously, how would that affect the price and the quantity? Now let's see some examples. So first, if there's something called a demand increase, think about the test change or think about income, increase in income. And simultaneously, so you have a demand, you have a supply decline. So for example, the cost of input increase or the technology slowing down, right? So how would that affect equilibrium? So we are going to see this is a new equilibrium. And why this is a new equilibrium? Because this is a new supply curve and a new demand curve, right? So this new supply and a new demand curve is going to jointly determine the new equilibrium. All right, okay. And then, so you're going to see the quantity increase and the price increase, right? And so how we end up with here? So first, if there's a demand increase, and then immediately you're going to see a shortage, right? As we discussed earlier, the shortage is going to lead to the price increase, and then so you're going to see the increase in quantity supplied. So this is the first step. This is before anything causes supply to change. So we move from E1 to here. Let's go E3. So this is the first step. Now, after we settled in E3, but then so there's a supply shock. The supply shock just move us down, right? Okay, so with this supply shock, but this is a temporary price, right? So maybe you can call it P3. Okay, so the supply shock leads to a shortage because now this with P3, so this is a quantity supplied, but this is the quantity demanded. There's another shortage. Then shortage is going to lead the price to rise again, but now there's nothing to affect demand, so we are going to move along this curve, move along to demand curve, right? So we are back to here. Right? So this is what happens. So we start from E1 to E2 and sorry, E3, and then eventually we go to E3. Sorry. So we sit right now. So we start from E1, and then we go to E3, and finally we move to E2. So E1 to E3 is caused by a demand increase. And E3 to E2 is caused by a supply decline. Right? So if we add them together, so this demand increase is going to lead to the impact of P and Q. So the demand increase is going to lead to price increase. and the quantity increase. But the supply decline is going to lead to price increase and the quantity decline. Right? And what will be the net impact? The net impact on P is clear. It's going to be positive because both demand increase and the supply decline leads to the price increase. But the impact on Q is less clear. Here, the net impact from the diagram seems like it's positive. And why that is because the rightward shift of the demand curve outweigh the left shift of the supply curve. Okay, so that's why at the end, so the quantity increase. Now we can look at other examples. Okay, and similarly, so you have increase in demand and a decrease in supply. And so again, so we can do the same analysis as we did before, right? So we draw a E3. Okay, so we move from E1 to E3 and E3 to E2. Again, so E1 to E3 and then to E2. E1 to E3 is caused by demand increase. And E3 to E2 is caused by supply decline. And again, so P and Q. So D increase is decline. D increase cause price and quantity increase. S decline cause price increase and quantity decrease. Right? So the net impact on price, okay, is crystal clear. It's going to be increase. But the impact on quantity is going to depend on which factor dominates. And here, clearly, so this negative impact dominates this positive impact. So we observe a decline in quantity. So we move from Q1 to Q2. Okay. All right, so let's look at one more practice question. So consumer in Mayville consider houses and apartment to be substitutes. There's an increase in prices of house. At the same time, there are new apartment building opens there. In the market for apartment, what happened? Okay. So essentially, we talk about two markets. One is the house market. The other is apartment market. At the end, we interesting to see what is happening in apartment market. But these two markets are substitute. Now let's see what happens in each market. In the market for houses, price increase, meaning this is going to lead to a demand decline. Right? And because house and apartment, they are substitutes, meaning so that's going to lead to a demand increase for apartment, right? Because they're substitute. Okay, so this price change is going to cause, let's just say, price increase. This leads to a positive demand shock on apartment. Right. Now, in the second part of this question states there are 3 new apartment building opens there. This is considered a positive supply shock. Right? Okay, so now if there's a positive supply shock and a positive demand shock, how would that affect price and the quantity? Now we look at the quantity, price and the quantity, right? Positive demand, positive supply. Start with positive demand. So if the demand increase, and then price is going to increase, and the quantity is going to increase. If the supply, if the positive supply shock, And then the price is going to decline and quantity is going to increase. Right? So now we add them together and then we can clearly see, so there's going to positive impact on quantity. All right? So that's essentially just apply what we learned in previous slides. Okay? To summarize how we are going to dealing with this type of questions. Let me write down here. First, identify the events. And secondly, identify this event is a demand shock or supply shock. And the third, so you need to identify its positive shock or negative shock. And lastly, so you just look at their impact on price and the quantity. Okay, so the way you look at the impact on price and quantity is trying to draw a table like I drew. Right. All right, so this is a lots of slides. Right, so this last slide just pick up a question. Okay. So what happened if we move away from competitive market? For now, we live in a perfect competitive. Right? So what happens if the market is not competitive anymore? Think about there's a monopoly. Okay? Or think about monopoly. So there's one buyer. Monopoly means you have one seller. Or in other case, you have one buyer. Okay? So if that's the case, and then the things becomes more complicated. Just use monopoly as example. Okay? So if there's only one seller, and then they can manipulate the price, or they can set the price. Okay? So in that case, anything change, like we observe, is going to have a more complicated impact on the price and the quantity. Okay? So we leave that for your micro class, either in principal or intermediate. Right? For now, I'm going to stop here and give you a 5 minute break for you to prepare. And then, so when we're coming back from the short break, we are going to quickly go through the sample questions for midterm 1.